Nobody warns you that the hardest part about being a widow isn't the silence in your house or the empty side of the bed. It's watching your own son look at you like you're something he stepped in by accident. But when my daughter-in-law Madison decided I was too much trouble to handle, I realized I had been playing the wrong game entirely. See, they thought I was just some helpless old woman counting pills and watching soap operas. What they didn't know was that I had been planning my exit strategy for 23 years. And when Madison finally pushed me too far, I didn't just leave. I took their entire world with me. My name is Dorothy Chen, and this is how I turned my daughter-in-law's worst nightmare into her permanent reality. It started on a Tuesday morning in October when I was making my famous apple pancakes, the ones my son John used to beg for when he was 8 years old and believed I could fix anything with flour and cinnamon. The kitchen smelled like comfort, like the mornings when he would sit at this same counter doing homework while I packed his lunch and told him stories about my childhood in Taiwan. I was flipping the last pancake when I heard Madison's car pull into the driveway with that sharp screech she never bothered to fix. Her heels clicked across my front porch like bullets hitting concrete. She didn't knock. She never knocked. She just walked into my house like she owned it, phone pressed to her ear, talking to someone about yoga classes and organic smoothies while completely ignoring my existence. I stood at the stove in my lavender housecoat, the one with tiny embroidered flowers that John bought me 3 Christmases ago, back when he still remembered I existed. Madison glanced at me once, wrinkled her nose at the pancakes, and continued her conversation about some expensive retreat in Costa Rica. I waited. I had learned patience from decades of waiting for people to remember I was human. When she finally hung up, Madison turned to me with that practiced smile she wore like expensive makeup. It never reached her eyes. Those stayed cold, calculating, measuring everything in terms of inconvenience and social media potential. She was beautiful in that harsh, polished way that required constant maintenance. Blonde hair that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, nails like perfect pink daggers, clothes that whispered about money and status, and the kind of life where old people were accessories you eventually discarded. "Dorothy," she said, perching on the edge of my kitchen stool like she might catch something if she settled in properly. "We need to talk about your living situation." I set down my spatula and turned to face her completely. The pancakes could wait. This conversation had been building for months, circling around us like a storm that everyone pretended not to see coming. "What about my living situation?" I asked quietly. Madison sighed dramatically, the way people do when they're about to deliver news they think is generous but is actually cruel. "John and I have been discussing it, and we think it's time you considered assisted living. Somewhere nice, somewhere with activities and people your own age." I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I kept my voice steady. "I live alone just fine. I cook, I clean, I drive, I manage my finances. What exactly do I need assistance with?" She waved her hand dismissively, those pink nails cutting through the air like she was erasing my words before they could land. "Dorothy, you're 71 years old. You fell last month getting out of the shower. You forget to turn off the stove sometimes. John worries constantly about you being here by yourself." I laughed, short and sharp. "John worries? When was the last time John called me? When was the last time he visited without you dragging him here for some obligation?" Madison's smile tightened. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You're becoming bitter, Dorothy, isolated. It's not healthy. You need supervision, structure, people trained to handle senior mood swings." "Handle me?" I repeated, slowly, like I'm some kind of difficult pet. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it instinctively, already half checked out of our conversation. "Look, Dorothy, I found 3 facilities within 30 minutes of our house. Beautiful places with gardens and craft rooms and organized activities. You could make friends, learn pottery, join book clubs. It would be so much better than sitting here alone, feeling sorry for yourself. I stared at her for a long moment, watching her thumb scroll through whatever was more important than this conversation. The pancakes were getting cold on the counter. The kitchen still smelled like apples and cinnamon, but something had shifted in the air, something that couldn't be sweetened or fixed. "What about this house?" I asked. Madison looked up from her phone like she'd forgotten I was talking. "Oh, we'll sell it, obviously. The market is incredible right now, and this neighborhood has really grown in value. John and I could use the equity for our renovation. We're putting in a pool and expanding the master suite." "I see. And where exactly do you imagine I'll be while you're swimming in my backyard?" Madison stood up, smoothing her perfect dress over her perfect figure. "Dorothy, you're being dramatic. The assisted living facility has everything you need. 3 meals a day, housekeeping, activity coordinators, medical staff on site 24/7. You'll have your own room, your own bathroom, everything handled for you." "My own room," I repeated. "In a building full of strangers, eating food I didn't choose, following schedules I didn't make, having my medications counted out like I'm a child who can't be trusted with aspirin?" Madison checked her phone again. "I really have to go. I have a trainer session at 11, and then Madison's expecting me for lunch. But think about what I said, okay? John and I only want what's best for you." She kissed the air near my cheek without actually touching me, and clicked toward the door on those ridiculous heels. "Oh, and Dorothy," she called over her shoulder, "you might want to start going through your things. Decide what's really important to keep. Most of these facilities have pretty strict space limitations." Then she was gone, leaving me standing in my kitchen, surrounded by the smell of cooling pancakes and the weight of everything she'd just stolen from me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't call John to ask if this was really what he wanted. Instead, I walked to my kitchen drawer, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and started making a list. But not the list Madison expected me to make. I wasn't cataloging which photographs fit in a suitcase or which books I could bear to give away. I was writing down every bank account, every investment, every piece of property, every carefully hidden asset I had accumulated for the past 23 years. Because Madison had made one critical mistake in her calculations. She assumed I was helpless, dependent, grateful for whatever scraps of dignity she decided to leave me. She had no idea that I had been preparing for this conversation since the day she married my son. See, I hadn't just been sitting in this house feeling sorry for myself like she thought. I had been watching, learning, planning. I had seen how Madison looked at my jewelry when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I had noticed how she measured rooms with her eyes and calculated square footage. I had heard her whispered conversations with John about my insurance policies and what would happen to my estate. So, I had started preparing, quietly, methodically, with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that the best revenge is always served with perfect timing and impeccable documentation. I opened my laptop, the one John insisted I didn't need, because what could an old woman possibly do with technology, and began transferring everything. Every stock portfolio I had built from decades of careful investing, every rental property I owned in 3 different states, every CD and bond and mutual fund I had accumulated by living below my means for 23 years. The money I had saved by driving a 12-year-old Honda instead of leasing luxury cars. The wealth I had built by shopping sales and clipping coupons, while Madison spent more on a single handbag than I spent on groceries in 6 months. By the time John came home that evening, I had moved everything. Not to assisted living facilities or nursing homes or anywhere Madison could calculate its value. I had transferred it all to my sister Ellen in Portland, the one who had never once suggested I was too old to live independently. The sister who called every Sunday just to talk, who sent care packages during winter storms, who flew down to spend Christmas with me even though her own children lived across the country. John found me in the living room, sitting in my reading chair with my hands folded calmly in my lap. He looked tired, older than his 43 years, worn down by whatever pressure Madison had been applying about the Dorothy problem. "Hey, Mom," he said, settling onto the couch with the heavy sigh of someone approaching an unpleasant task. "Madison told me you two had a conversation today about assisted living." I nodded. We did. She presented several compelling arguments for why I should surrender my independence, sell my home, and allow you both to manage my life going forward. John ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his teenage years when he was trying to explain why his grades had slipped or why he'd missed curfew. "Mom, we're worried about you. This house is too big, too much work. You're isolated here, and if something happened, we might not know for days." Those are reasonable concerns. 3 days before my scheduled trip to Oregon, John arrived at my house with a folder full of brochures and contracts. He looked nervous, guilty, like a child who had been caught breaking something valuable and was hoping confession might minimize his punishment. "Mom," he said, settling onto my couch with the heavy sigh I had come to recognize as his signature approach to difficult conversations. "Madison and I have been doing more research, talking to social workers and geriatric specialists. We think we found the perfect place for you." He spread the brochures across my coffee table like he was dealing cards. Sunset Manor was advertised as a premier senior living facility with graduated care levels from independent apartments to full nursing support. The photographs showed smiling elderly people engaged in craft projects and exercise classes. The amenities list included housekeeping services, medication management, nutritional planning, and 24-hour emergency response. The monthly fees started at $4,000 for a studio apartment and increased based on the level of care required. John walked me through each brochure with the enthusiasm of a salesman, pointing out features like the on-site beauty salon and the weekly entertainment programs. "Mom," he said, "they even have a shuttle service for grocery shopping and medical appointments. You wouldn't have to worry about driving anymore, especially in bad weather." I listened patiently, nodding at appropriate moments, asking questions about visiting policies and pet restrictions. When he finished his presentation, I gathered the brochures into a neat stack and set them aside. "John," I said, "I appreciate the research you and Madison have done. These facilities look very nice for people who need the services they provide. Unfortunately, I'm not one of those people. I don't need help with medications, housekeeping, meal planning, or transportation. I need something different." I pulled out my own folder filled with information about Riverstone Gardens and my planned move to Oregon. I showed him photographs of the apartments, the gardens, the community spaces designed for active seniors who wanted social opportunities without institutional oversight. I explained the financial advantages of buying into a community rather than renting month by month with no equity building. Most importantly, I showed him the timeline I had developed. I would spend January and February visiting Ellen and exploring different neighborhoods in Portland. If I decided to move permanently, I would list my house in March when the real estate market typically improved and relocate by summer. If Oregon didn't work out, I would return and explore other options, but I would make that decision myself based on my own priorities and preferences. John listened with growing frustration, interrupting frequently to point out practical problems with my plan. Oregon was too far away for him to help if I needed anything. I didn't know anyone there except Ellen. The weather was different, the healthcare systems were unfamiliar, the cost of living might be higher than I anticipated. What if I got sick and couldn't fly back? What if Ellen's health declined and she couldn't provide the support I might need? All valid concerns, I agreed, which is why I'm planning carefully, researching thoroughly, and moving gradually. I'm not running away impulsively, John. I'm making an informed decision about how I want to spend the next chapter of my life. "But, Mom," he said, his voice rising with exasperation, "why Oregon? Why move away from your family, your friends, your support system? Why choose isolation when we're offering community? I stared at my son for a long moment, wondering when he had learned to speak in Madison's voice, to echo her priorities as if they were his own original thoughts. "John," I said, quietly, "you keep talking about family and support systems. When was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you visited without an agenda? When was the last time you asked me what I wanted, instead of telling me what you thought I needed?" He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. I could see him mentally scrolling through recent interactions, looking for evidence that contradicted my observation. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of all the conversations we hadn't had, all the moments when connection might have been possible, but convenience had been chosen instead. "John," I said, "I know I haven't been the most attentive son lately. Madison and I have been busy with work, with planning for our future. But that doesn't mean we don't care about you. It just means we need systems in place so caring doesn't become overwhelming." I nodded slowly. "I understand completely, John. And that's exactly why I'm moving to Oregon, so caring for me won't become overwhelming for anyone. So you and Madison can focus on your careers and your renovations and your future children without worrying about whether I'm managing my medications correctly or feeling lonely on Sundays." "But Mom, Oregon is so far away. What if something happens to you? What if you need us?" "Then you'll get a phone call, just like you would if I were in assisted living 20 minutes from your house," I said. "The difference is that I'll be living independently among people who chose to be there, not people who were sent there by families who found them inconvenient." We went around in circles for another hour, John trying to convince me that local assisted living was superior to independent living in Oregon, me trying to help him understand that proximity without relationship was worse than distance with respect. Finally, exhausted and frustrated, John gathered up his brochures and headed towards the door. "Mom," he said, his hand on the doorknob, "Madison is going to be really disappointed. She put a lot of work into research in these places. She even called ahead to arrange tours and talk to the directors about your specific needs." "I'm sure she did," I said. "But John, my specific needs don't include having my life managed by someone who has never asked me what would make me happy." He left without saying goodbye, and I knew the next conversation would not be with John alone. Sure enough, 2 days later, Madison arrived without John, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she was prepared to negotiate but not to surrender. "Dorothy," she said, settling into my living room like she was claiming territory, "John told me about your Oregon plan. I have to say I'm concerned about several aspects of what you're proposing." She opened her portfolio and spread documents across my coffee table with the efficiency of someone accustomed to presentations and PowerPoint slides. "I've done some research on Riverstone Gardens, and there are some red flags I think you should be aware of. The facility is only 8 years old, so there's no long-term track record of financial stability. The healthcare partnerships are with smaller regional hospitals rather than major medical centers. The waiting list you mentioned is actually a marketing strategy to create artificial scarcity and justify higher fees." She continued for 20 minutes, systematically dismantling every aspect of my Oregon plan with the thoroughness of someone who had clearly spent considerable time researching ammunition for this conversation. I listened without interrupting, impressed, despite myself, by the depth of her investigation and the sophistication of her counter-arguments. When she finished, I poured myself a cup of tea and settled back in my reading chair. "Madison," I said, "I appreciate the time you've invested in researching my options. You've raised some legitimate concerns about Riverstone Gardens that I'll need to investigate further. Thank you for that information." She smiled, clearly expecting me to concede defeat and accept her superior research. "However," I continued, "I'm curious about something. You've spent considerable effort finding problems with my plan, but I don't hear you offering solutions that address my actual priorities. You're telling me why I shouldn't move to Oregon, but you haven't asked me why I want to leave Charleston." Madison's smile faltered slightly. "Dorothy, of course, I care about your happiness. I want you to be comfortable and safe and engaged. That's why John and I have been working so hard to find the right assisted living facility. We want you to have activities and social opportunities and support services." "Well," I said, "let me tell you what would actually make me happy, Madison. I want to wake up when my body is ready to wake up, not when an activities coordinator decides it's breakfast time. I want to cook my own meals when I'm hungry, not eat institutional food served on schedule. I want to choose my own social activities based on my interests, not sign up for crafts and games designed to keep elderly people occupied. I want to maintain my privacy, my independence, my right to make decisions about my own life. I want to live among peers who chose to be there, not people who were placed there by families who found them inconvenient." Madison shifted in her chair, her professional composure beginning to crack. "Dorothy, you're making this sound like we want to imprison you. We're talking about beautiful facilities with amenities and services. You'd have your own apartment, your own space, your own choices within a supportive community structure. Within limits set by people who don't know me and rules designed for people who can't manage their own affairs," I said. "Madison, assisted living is not about supporting independence. It's about managing dependence in the most efficient way possible. It's about creating systems where families can feel good about warehousing elderly relatives without actually having to maintain relationships with them." "That's not fair," Madison said, her voice rising slightly. "John loves you. He visits you regularly. He calls to check on you." Instead, I called my lawyer. "Dorothy, how can I help you?" David Brennan had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years, ever since I bought my first rental property and needed someone to navigate the complexities of landlord responsibilities and tax implications. "David, I need to make some changes to my estate planning. I want to protect my assets in case my family decides I'm incompetent and tries to establish guardianship over my affairs." There was a pause. "Dorothy, is someone pressuring you to make decisions you're not comfortable with?" "Not yet," I said, "but I can see it coming. My son and daughter-in-law want me in assisted living, and they're not particularly interested in what I want. I need to make sure they can't override my autonomy just because it would be more convenient for them." We scheduled a meeting for the following week. David explained the legal mechanisms available for protecting my independence, including advance directives that specified my preferences for care, power of attorney documents that designated Ellen instead of John as my representative, and trust arrangements that would prevent anyone from accessing my assets without my explicit consent. We also discussed the nuclear option. If John and Madison persisted in trying to force institutional care against my wishes, I could liquidate everything and move to Oregon immediately, transferring my assets out of South Carolina jurisdiction and establishing residency in a state where they would have no legal standing to challenge my decisions. I hoped it wouldn't come to that. I still believed that rational conversation and compromise might be possible. I still wanted to maintain a relationship with John and to be part of my grandchild's life. But I was no longer willing to sacrifice my autonomy for the sake of family harmony. The next few months were a careful dance of negotiation and preparation. I made the modifications to my house that would support aging in place. I established relationships with local service providers who could assist with housekeeping, transportation, and personal care if needed. I maintained regular contact with John and Madison, providing updates on my health and daily activities to demonstrate my continued competence. But I also prepared for war. I met with David monthly to update my legal documents. I researched housing options in Oregon and maintained my application at Riverstone Gardens. I transferred additional assets to Ellen's name and established bank accounts in Portland. Most importantly, I began documenting every interaction with John and Madison, keeping careful records of their demands and ultimatums, their threats and manipulations, their systematic attempt to undermine my confidence in my own judgment. because I knew that eventually the careful balance we had negotiated would collapse. I knew that Madison's pregnancy would become the excuse for escalating pressure, that the baby's needs would be used to justify overriding my preferences, that my continued independence would be framed as selfishness rather than self-determination. I was right. In my 6th month of Madison's pregnancy, John arrived at my house with another folder of brochures and a new urgency in his voice. "Mom," he said, settling onto my couch with the familiar sigh that indicated an unpleasant conversation ahead, "we need to finalize your living arrangements. Madison is having complications with the pregnancy, and her doctor has ordered bed rest for the remaining 3 months." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Actually, there is," John said. "We need you to be settled somewhere permanent so we don't have to worry about you while we're dealing with Madison's health issues and preparing for the baby." He spread the brochures across my coffee table, the same assisted living facilities we had discussed months earlier. "Mom, I've already spoken with the directors at these places. They have openings available and they're willing to expedite the application process, given our circumstances. We could have you moved within 2 weeks." I looked at the smiling elderly faces in the photographs, the craft rooms and dining halls and medical stations, all designed to manage aging efficiently rather than honor it gracefully. "John," I said, "Madison's pregnancy complications don't change my ability to live independently or my desire to maintain my autonomy." "Mom," he said, his voice rising with frustration, "this isn't about what you want anymore. This is about what our family needs. Madison is scared about the pregnancy, I'm working extra hours to cover her lost income, and we can't handle the added stress of worrying about whether you're okay living alone." "So my independence is now classified as added stress," I said quietly. "My right to make decisions about my own life is now a burden that your family can't handle." John ran his hands through his hair, the gesture I remembered from his teenage years when he was trying to explain why rules didn't apply to him. "Mom, you're being unreasonable. We're not trying to hurt you or control you. We're trying to be responsible for everyone's welfare, including yours. You keep talking about your rights and your autonomy, but what about our rights? What about our need to know you're safe so we can focus on our own family?" I stared at my son for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time the man he had become. Not cruel exactly, but fundamentally selfish. Not malicious, but incapable of imagining that other people's needs might be equally valid as his own. Not evil, but willing to sacrifice anyone's well-being for his own convenience and peace of mind. "John," I said, standing up and walking to my desk, "I want to show you something." I pulled out the folder containing documentation of our conversations over the past 6 months, printed emails and transcribed phone calls, and detailed records of every promise made and broken. "This is a timeline of our negotiations about my living arrangements," I said, handing him the papers. "I want you to read through it and tell me when you think I stopped being reasonable and started being selfish." He scanned the documents, his face growing pale as he recognized his own words, his own escalating demands, his own systematic attempt to undermine my confidence in my own judgment. "Mom," he said finally, "I didn't realize we'd been going in circles for so long. I thought we were making progress, finding solutions that worked for everyone." "We were until Madison got pregnant and my needs stopped mattering," I said. "We were making progress until you decided that my autonomy was incompatible with your peace of mind." John set down the papers and looked at me with something that might have been recognition or might have been defeat. "Mom, what do you want me to do? I can't undo Madison's pregnancy. I can't make her health complications disappear. I can't eliminate the stress we're feeling about managing everything on our plates." "I don't want you to undo anything, John," I said. "I want you to stop making my independence contingent on your convenience. I want you to support my right to make decisions about my own life instead of trying to override those decisions because they don't fit your timeline." "But how can I do that?" he asked. "How can I focus on Madison and the baby if I'm constantly worried about whether you're okay living alone?" the same way millions of other people manage relationships with aging parents, by staying in touch, by offering help when it's needed, by respecting boundaries while maintaining connection. We talked for another hour, covering the same ground we had covered dozens of times before. John wanted guarantees that I would be safe, that I wouldn't need emergency help when he wasn't available, that I wouldn't become a crisis requiring his immediate attention at inconvenient moments. I wanted respect for my judgment, support for my independence, and acknowledgement that my needs and preferences had value equal to his own. We were asking each other for things that felt mutually exclusive: security versus autonomy, convenience versus dignity. Finally, exhausted and emotional, John gathered up his brochures and headed toward the door. "Mom," he said, his voice heavy with resignation, "I can't keep having this conversation forever. Madison and I need to know that you're settled somewhere permanent before the baby comes. If you won't choose assisted living, then we'll have to explore other options." "What other options?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Legal guardianship," he said quietly. "If we can demonstrate that you're not making rational decisions about your own welfare, we can petition the court to override your preferences and place you in protective custody." I felt the world tilt slightly, the way it does when you realize that people you trusted have been planning to betray you all along. "John," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "are you threatening to have me declared incompetent because I won't agree to be institutionalized for your convenience?" He couldn't meet my eyes. "Mom, I don't want it to come to that. I really don't. But if you keep refusing reasonable accommodations for your age and health status, if you keep insisting on living alone despite the risks, then we might not have any other choice." After he left, I sat in my living room for hours trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. My own son, the child I had raised and sacrificed for and loved unconditionally, had just threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent and stripped of my legal rights because I wouldn't surrender my autonomy voluntarily. I thought about calling David immediately, activating the legal protections we had discussed, beginning the process of moving to Oregon before John and Madison could file their petition. But something held me back, some stubborn hope that this had been an empty threat, made in frustration, rather than a calculated strategy they were prepared to implement. I was wrong about that too. 2 weeks later, I received legal papers informing me that Joan and Madison had petitioned the court to establish guardianship over my person and my property, claiming that I was no longer— "John," I said finally, "you made your choice when you filed that petition. You chose legal authority over emotional connection. You chose to treat me like a problem instead of a person. Now you have to live with the consequences of that choice." "But Mom," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "you're my mother. I love you. I don't want to lose you over this." "You lost me the day you decided that your peace of mind was more important than my freedom," I said. "You lost me when you chose convenience over relationship, when you decided that managing my life was more important than respecting my choices." I hung up the phone and sat in Ellen's garden, surrounded by flowers I was learning to identify and birds whose songs were becoming familiar. I thought about John, about the little boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, who brought me dandelions and called them flowers, who believed I could fix anything with Band-Aids and ice cream. I mourned that child, and I mourned the relationship we might have had if he had grown into a man who understood that love means supporting people in becoming their best selves, rather than diminishing them for your own comfort. But I didn't regret leaving. I didn't regret choosing freedom over family harmony, autonomy over security, dignity over convenience. I had learned that some prices are too high to pay, that some compromises destroy the very thing they're meant to preserve. 6 months later, Ellen and I were shopping for groceries when I saw the news report on the store television. John and Madison were filing for bankruptcy, unable to afford the mortgage on their renovated house without the rental income from my properties or the equity from my assets. Madison had lost the baby during her 7th month, a tragedy that had nothing to do with my absence, but everything to do with the stress they had created by choosing legal warfare over family relationship. They were selling their house, moving to a smaller apartment, and starting over with nothing except the legal guardianship they had fought so hard to obtain. I felt sad for their losses, genuinely sorry for the pain they were experiencing, but I didn't feel responsible for their consequences. They had created their own crisis by trying to solve a problem that didn't exist, by treating my independence as a threat to be eliminated rather than a choice to be respected. I never called John to offer sympathy or support. I never reached out to Madison to acknowledge their grief. I had learned that some relationships can't be repaired, that some betrayals can't be forgiven, that some choices create permanent distance between people who once loved each other. Instead, I focused on building a new life in Portland, one based on my own priorities rather than other people's expectations. I joined a book club at the local library, volunteered at a community garden, took watercolor classes at the senior center. I made friends with people who were interested in my thoughts and opinions rather than my medical history, who invited me to coffee because they enjoyed my company rather than because they felt obligated to check on my welfare. Most importantly, I woke up every morning knowing that the day ahead belonged to me, that the choices I made would be my own, that no one had the legal authority to override my decisions or the moral authority to diminish my dignity. John calls occasionally, usually on holidays or my birthday, brief conversations filled with awkward pauses and careful politeness. He tells me about his work, his new apartment, his attempts to rebuild his financial security. I listen politely and share updates about my life in Portland, my health, my activities, but we never talk about guardianship proceedings or assisted living facilities, or the fundamental disagreement about autonomy versus security that destroyed our relationship. We're cordial strangers now, connected by history, but separated by choices that can't be undone. He chose control over love, convenience over respect, management over relationship. I chose freedom over family, dignity over security, autonomy over approval. Neither of us got what we thought we wanted, but I got something more valuable than what I lost. I got my life back. I got the right to make my own decisions, face my own consequences, write my own ending. And every morning when I wake up in my small apartment overlooking the mountains, when I choose what to wear and what to eat and how to spend my time, I remember that some battles are worth fighting, even when the cost is everything you thought you couldn't live without. Because it turns out that living free is better than living safely, that choosing your own mistakes is better than accepting someone else's protection, that writing your own story is better than letting other people edit it for their convenience. Madison learned what real burden looks like when she lost everything she thought my dependency would give her. John learned what happens when you mistake control for care, when you choose legal authority over emotional connection. And I learned that sometimes the only way to save a relationship is to be willing to lose it, that sometimes the only way to preserve love is to refuse to let it be diminished by fear. I'm 74 now, living independently in a city I chose, surrounded by relationships I built, making decisions based on my own judgment rather than other people's convenience. I may not have the family I thought I wanted, but I have something more precious: the knowledge that every day I live is mine to shape according to my values and priorities. That's not the ending John and Madison planned for me, but it's the ending I chose for myself. And in the end, that's the only thing that matters.